Past Revisited by Renato Constantino.
Cover of the book. The book consists of four parts. Part 1, The Liberation Transformed, that has chapter 1 to 6. Part 2, The Crucible of Practice, that has chapter 7 to 10. Part 3, Unity and Disunity, that has chapter 11 to 17. And Part 4, The Prologue, that has chapter 18. It has 18 chapters in total.
Summary of the book. In 1975, Renato Constantino released the Philippines a Past Revisited with the help of his wife, Leticia R. Constantino. This work primarily serves as Constantino's endeavor to widen and enlarge the understanding of the Filipino in Philippine history. It critically analyzes Philippine history from the early colonial period through the end of World War II, providing true information on colonizers' manipulation, struggles, and persecution of the Filipino people. Wherein in the first chapter, Constantino repeatedly stated that the Philippines can only attain true liberty and interpret current events by focusing and understanding on the colonial experiences of Filipino masses. According to his statements, it is critical for historians to consider the experiences and perspectives of ethnic minorities while writing Philippine history. The masses' revelations and corrections of historical misunderstandings will have a significant impact on how people perceive history today. This would also allow Filipinos to properly see how the country's fictitious culture and identity were generated by the country's lengthy colonial past, as well as recognize how some historical events depicted in textbooks were tainted with racism and bigotry. We may have historical truths from biased texts produced by foreign historians in order or in our understanding of Philippine history. When it comes to Philippine pre-colonial age, it's clear that the country had a diversified culture with a limited population and a fewer data-ruled barangays. It boasts an abundance of natural resources that have historically been utilized to support humanity. According to the book, autonomous barangay communities have a subsistence agriculture system that provides them with sufficient food sources to meet their daily needs. Natives are accustomed to taking only what they require and have no desire to become affluent, thus, there is no surplus. They do not understand that owning and controlling private properties translates to owning and controlling other primitive economic entities. Although Biringanic civilization has a social stratification with a master and a slave, their ties are not rigid because they are simply debtors paying debts in the form of slavery. During this time, many groups such as the Muslim South began their transition into a class society in which wealth became a determining element of authority and access to resources. It is well stated that societies already have hierarchy, but it is not fully formed. Chiefs, freemen, and dependent slaves have all existed in the past, does not prelude the creation of a class system as a whole. Natives lived in peace until invaders colonized them and deceived them with Faris liberation's ideals. According to the book, Spaniards came to the Philippines to free them from the devil's enslavement. Then Americans came to free them from Spanish persecution, and then Japanese liberated them from American imperialism. Then Americans came back to free them from Japanese faces. These colonizers induced natives to believe that they had good intentions and that their policies were in the country's best interest rather than their own. Yet, there was betrayal, strife, and constant persecution going on behind the scenes. Because Constantino's work includes extensive and plain historical details of Americans and Spaniards' justification throughout colonialism. In their quest for the true independence, the Philippines developed a sense of animosity and antagonism toward these countries. It is clear that during Spain's colonization of the Philippines, Spaniards introduced feudalism in which landowners provided lands to tenants in exchange for their loyalty and services. Friars have historically been involved in the atrocities and oppressions that native people have endured. Slavery was employed extensively to take properties and produce, as well as religious pretexts to hide the true motivations for colonization. Constantino discovered the instruments of pacification utilized by Spaniards at this time, particularly the encomienda and hacienda systems, which considerably contributed to Indians' ongoing misery. In the Philippines, the encomienda system was established with the goal of providing security and education to the people. The original goal, according to the book, was to ensure that locals were adequately protected from the colony while also educating them about Catholicism. During colonization, however, encomienda was regarded as a means of amassing wealth that resulted in widespread exploitation of the indigenous people. They were forced to convert to Catholicism, that were made to pay higher tribute that done on non-Catholics, and were treated as slaves by encomenderos. Furthermore, Spaniards imposed exploitation through a variety of methods, including polo y servicio, the bandala system, and the reducción. Polo y servicio is a practice that requires native men between the ages of 16 and 60 to work for 40 days. The polo rules stipulate that each polista receives paid and rice, that they are not to be transported to far locations, and that they are not compelled to labor during harvesting seasons. Nonetheless, Polo's employees were forced to work nonstop. They were also treated like slaves, and were denied nourishment. Another exploitative instrument from the first half of the 17th century is that the Dambala system, which is the type of direct tax that requires native farmers to sell their produce items to the government at the lowest feasible cost using only promissory notes. The primary goal of this strategy was uh, to increase funding for battles against European countries. Due to unjust colonial expressions, abuses, and economic injustices perpetrated primarily by the church, including frequent interference in their daily lives, personal insult, sexual offenses against women, forced labor, and charging additional tributes and taxes to natives. And then the masses began to revolt against the colonizers. When people's anguish and agony reached a breaking point as a result of colonial injustices, they turned violently against the friars. The first one is the Boholano Revolution that was led by Francisco de Gojoy. It was one of the most successful and longest resistance efforts in Philippine history, lasting 85 years. It was one of the two major revolts in Bohol during the Spanish rule. The other being is the Tamblot uprising, which rejected the spread of Catholicism in their town by the Spaniards. The Gohoy's reason for revolting against Spaniards was once aggravated and ignited by forced labor, excessive tax collection, and Spanish oppression also. Constantino also exposed the betrayal and self-interest of some Filipinos, which resulted in multiple failed revolts against the Spaniards and extended the colonization period in the Philippines. Diego Silang, for example, takes advantage of people's frustrations to become the head of the Ilocanos rebellion against the official system. Silang eliminated tributes and forced labor during his reign, as well as confiscating the church proprietors and his own class money, or using his own class money. That was according to Constantino 1975. And then Silang prioritizes himself and chooses to seek British protection when the Spaniards offer him an ultimatum, despite the fact that he has the ability to become a good leader of the oppressed. The Ilustrados, who look to be intermediates and vanguards of the propaganda movement in the late 19th century, undoubtedly contributed to the advancement of Philippine history by their works that aligned with the struggles of the masses. It awakens the bulk of people's sense of nationality and consciousness against colonial oppression through their articulation and resentments. However, Constantino highlighted in this book that these elites were also reformists who choose to be governed to be governed by Spain, because they believe that by doing so people would be able to acquire equal rights as Spaniards rather than fighting for full independence. It was also mentioned in the book that conquerors in the Philippines exploited agreeable accommodation and greedy negotiations between Americans and Ilustrados as justification. As a result, on the ongoing act of resistance to Spanish colonization, forest leaders gradually emerged to lead the fight against the oppressors. Even though the resistance was effective, some of the leaders became traitors and exploiters of their own people. Unfortunately, most of the devoted ones were undervalued and uncredited for their role in raising colonial understanding and consciousness among the locals. Under American occupation, people's yearning for true liberation, remained unfulfilled. However, conquerors have once again deceived the Filipinos by imposing a twisted and inadequate perspective of reality as a result of miseducation, or as a result of their miseducation. Americans persuaded them that independence was a genuine gift from the United States. It's worth emphasizing that education has proven to be the most successful tool for conquering the Philippines. During this time, the Americans not only seized control of the Philippines but also of every citizen's mentality. Because education was a tool for colonization, so Americans utilized it to exploit the Indians economically. This purpose of educating Filipinos was nearly a cover for their true political goal of Filipinizing the colonial administration. The influence of American colonialism can still be seen and felt in Philippine culture today. Filipinos still experience an inadequacy and insufficiency when comparing themselves to others because of their colonial mentality and inferiority complex. Having a fairer or whiter skin, for example, is the actual standard of beauty, as ingrained in Filipino thinking. Dark skinned persons, on the other hand, are always linked with being unattractive and belonging to a lower social class. Sinasabi po rito na dahil maganda yung maputi, nagiging kasalanan na ang pagiging kayumanggi. So ito ay according kay Abin 2018. This quote can also be linked to racism, as numerous reports of Black individuals being abused in the media have circulated in recent years. For the most part, it appears that racial discrimination still exists today. To be honest, Filipinos like degrading their own racial group in order to gain social legitimacy by improving their appearance or improving their appearance. Uh, and here, of course, there's nothing wrong with that. But of course, we must, however, understand that every race has a role to play in the development of a better society. Colonizers from other countries did in fact completely rule the Philippines' political and intellectual landscape. Our culture, traditions, beliefs, and rituals are heavily influenced by American and Asian cultures. The religion of the Filipinos have been heavily influenced by Spaniards who have built altars, worship gods, and dedicated their lives to saints. Tagalog has a similar relation to Spanish dialect in terms of language and surnames. The culture and traditions of Spain have impacted some of the annual holidays and celebrations. American and other Asian influences, on the other hand, will be prominent in commerce, trade, food, dress, music, and language. As long as the Philippines continues to adopt the colonizers' modified culture and traditions, our identity as Filipinos will be called into doubt. Unfortunately, as Constantino explained in his book, the title Filipino was not originally ours and had a racial and snobbish connotation. It was once used to define Spaniards born in the Philippines and other privileged groups with wealth, education, and Spanish culture before eventually becoming a national identity for Filipinos. In conclusion, Renato Constantino critical review and reassessment of Philippine history in his book The Philippines a Past Revisited was a successful step in enlightening Filipinos. His goal of increasing the understanding of the future generations through revisiting the past has been accomplished. It's also worth noticing that his work was made to big contribution to the collecting of usable history and will continue to do so in the future. Constantino's perspective on the life experience, sufferings, and struggles of the masses as the foundation of Philippine historiography would always be a sound decision in redefining history and correcting reality. We can only really understand history as a coherent and collaborative process if historians take the time to investigate the other side of the narrative. There is so much more to learn about Philippine history. All we have to do is to examine all areas of the country's formation and living patterns. Exploring the history of the Philippines is similar to giving deeper into the world's largest ocean. The deeper you go, the more discoveries and revelations you'll come across. Your consciousness and awareness will be heightened, and you will be hungry to learn more about reality. Summary of each chapter 1 to 9. Chapter 1, Towards People's History. It examined how Philippine history should be written and recorded, with Renato Constantino emphasizing that there can be no history without society and there are no societies without men. A people's history, as previously stated, is required in order for us to rediscover the past in order to reuse it in the future and change the society. The greatest method to construct a Filipino narrative of the Philippines is from the perspective of the people's sufferings because the Filipino is a product of these difficulties. The struggles of people or individuals in the past inform people's culture. The potential for rediscovering history to substantially modify and transform lives is enormous. Chapter 2. This is the First Liberation, wherein Filipino citizens have been released 4 times in the past. Spaniards were the first to liberate humanity from the devil's yoke. The Americans arrived after the Spaniards and rescued us from Spanish oppression. The Japanese, the third group, arrived and liberated us from American imperialism. Then another American came along and liberated us from the Japanese fascists. One of the most important parts of this is that Filipinos must be able to recognize and comprehend the features of foreign cultures that are attempting to study social formation and then conduct conquests in the Philippines. They had them wrapped around their finger at that point, and they took advantage of it with their own agendas due to the Filipino people's generosity, a lack of awareness and consciousness of one's surroundings. Chapter 3, Baranganic Societies. Baranganic societies are a type of barangay. In this chapter, it is implied or said that Spanish clerical records abandoned a proto-anthropological observational tradition. When we say proto-anthropology po, it means it is the study of humans prior to invention of writing. And then going back, the factors are the first is the lack of social anthropology training. And then the second one is there is a natural tendency for missionaries to interpret and explain occurrences in ways that justify their presence. Then there's the issue of their inability. In addition, aristocrats, commoners, and slaves have begun to embark in Biringanic societies. Nobles are a social class seen in some civilization with a formal aristocracy that is usually placed directly behind monarchy. Ordinary citizens are known as commoners. Slaves, on the other hand, are those who are forced to obey another's legal property. The samurai's tiny cultures found in the conquered by the Spaniards were mainly societies in transition. Chapter 4: Pacification and Exploitation. Many Spaniards admire Magellan's expedition. They traveled to the East Indies in search of new discoveries and conquests. Because the Portuguese monarchy is a rival of the Spanish monarchy, they are eager and motivated to expand their monarchy and defend or maintain their claimed territories in the east. These two adversaries were both interested in gold and spices because they felt that the West Island had plenty of them. Later, King Philip of Spain consented to organize a trip to the East Indies. Chapter 5: The Colonial Landscape. Because of the Spanish conquest, the lives of the indigenous people were changed forever. As a result, Spaniards accepted new activities and organizations as well as modern traditions and beliefs. As a result of their colonial experiences, they have adopted plants and livestock that have been bought in to aid with economic development. And overall, the Spaniards' conquest results a change. Chapter 6: Monastic Supremacy. It was mentioned that this is to serve God and King. Then there's the Patronatorial, which is the merger of church and state, with the state playing a significant role in church administration and support. The church organization, staff, and social position were all established early in the colonial period. Chapter 7: Patterns of Struggle. The legacy of its people struggle for democracy and a better living, as stated in the book, is the most fundamental component of Philippine history. The struggle between Lapu-Lapu and Ferdinand Magellan began in the early stages of resentment. By 1587, the alliance leaders had launched yet another attempt. Magat Salamat and Agustin de Legazpi were their names, and it also discusses people's revolts in which there are negative responses to colonial oppression rather than positive responses to national ambitions. Chapter 8: End of Isolation. In the early 17th century, more than 20,000 Chinese people settled in Manila. The English became the dominant trading partner in the colonies due to greater industrial methods and ocean regulation. In addition, the Philippine economy undergoes a shift in the 19th century. It grew increasingly significant to the nation as a volume of Philippine trade expanded. Chapter 9: Progress and Protests. The end of Philippine isolation occurred around the middle of the 18th century and around the turn of the 19th century. More than one person was implicated. Simply, the physical opening of the country to foreign trade. In addition, it makes new concepts more clear and enlightened, making Europe more convenient. These new ideals, which were based on the principle of individual liberty, were the backbone of the movement. Because of the concept of growing capitalism's philosophy and the colony's new Spanish economic policies and the resulting social forces that desired a better environment for their own growth resulted in precisely funding fertile terrain within the country. Until recently, there have been countries that have focused on their own development, such as Spain's economic policies. On the other hand, in order to accomplish development and advancement, social and political principles must be widely shared. In the Philippines, the Spaniards promoted the government's political policies. They intended to boost the local economy as a revenue source. The people will suffer as a result of this intention.
Chapter 10. What were the important points or details discussed in this chapter? The new Filipinos. The first Filipinos were the Españolos. Filipinos are two whites who are the Spaniards born in the Philippines. At kinalaunan ang termino ng Filipino ay tumutukoy sa mga naninirahan sa mga kapuluan ng Pilipinas. Next is the reform movements. Three groups from the nucleus of the movement for reforms which has come to be known as the propaganda movement. Through the pages of Plaza de Solidaridad, hinimok ng mga kilusang propaganda ang mga Filipino na kalayaan sa pamamahayag, sa salita at pagpupulong, pagkakapantay-pantay sa harap ng batas, pakikilahok sa mga gawain ng pamahalaan, kalayaan sa lipunan at pangpolitika. Humiling din ng mga propaganda ng mga reforma sa lahat ng mga sangay ng gobyerno, pagsusulong ng edukasyon, paghinto sa mga pang-aabuso ng Guardia Civil at pagtapos sa di makatwirang pagkapatapon sa mga mamamayan. Next is assimilation and representation. Despite all their criticism and complaints, the propagandist goal was still assimilation. That is why they were asking for Philippine representation in the Spanish courtesy. Next is the reformist demand. The propagandists failed to achieve the principal objective. It has been argued that since the propaganda writers failed to reach the masses of their countrymen, their influence may be regarded as minimal. And for this reason, there was hardly any continuity between the propaganda and the revolution. Rizal's Liga. In July 1892, Rizal organized the League of Filipinos. This constituted a forward step in the reformist ideas of the times in the sense that the new group sought to involve the Philippines directly in the reform movement. Next is the split. Sa una, naging aktibo ang Liga, but after a few months later, however, the Supreme Council of the Liga dissolved the society. Karamihan sa mga tanyag na konseho na naayos ni Bonifacio ay hindi na nais magpadala ng mga punto. Sa mga propaganda sapagkat tulad ni Bonifacio, naging kumbinsido sila na ang mapayapang pag-aalsa para sa mga reforma ay walang kabuluhan. Next is the ambivalent classes. Economic progress had brought into being in the Philippine society a number of transitional economic and social groups composed of plurals. Urban ideas and rural masses. Revolution is spread rapidly and often spontaneously to other areas shows that through the centuries the desire to throw off the Spanish rock had become universal. So next is the urban sense of solidarity. A greater awareness of common deprivation and oppression was made possible by economic progress. Chapter 11, Revolution and Compromise. In this chapter, Rizal was already died. When he died, Bonifacio activated his propaganda movement, that is Katipunan. But then, the Katipunan was revealed to the Spaniards authorities because some of the members of the movement were betrayed them. Katipunan symbolizes the passage of leadership from the hands of the stimulationists, ilustrados, to the separatist, lower middle class, leader of the people. In simple means, in known Katipunan as a group of Filipinos who fought the colonizers, but more than, we know that the Katipunan, it was formed or established after the dissolution of the Liga Filipina. So, before the Katipunan, there's the Liga Filipina movement, founded by Rizal, which simply came to unite the Filipinos. Pero, ang tanong, bakit nga ba sila nabuwag? Based from our history, it is due to the differences and principles among the members of a La Liga Filipina. Pero hindi ibig sabihin na nabuwag na ang La Liga Filipina ay wala na magkapatuloy. So, matapos na maitatag ang Katipunan, nagsimula na rin silang magpalawak ng hukbo, pero bakit tila masyadong aktibo ang mga Pilipino sa pagsali sa Katipunan? Gayong alam naman nila na na kamatayan at paghihirap lang yung naghihintay sa kanila rito. So, ano nga ba ang layunin ng Katipunan? As a movement, Katipunan aims to overthrow the Spanish rule to be achieved to armed struggle. Sa madaling salita, they aim for liberty, and for them to achieve it, kailangan nilang makipaglaban dito dahil dito makikita natin ang simpatsya na pagnanais ng mga Pilipino na makalaya mula sa mga dayuhan. Magkaibang paraan ng pakikipaglaban ng Liga at Katipunan. Kung ang Liga ay lumalaban sa pamamagitan ng paglalathala, ang Katipunan naman ay nakikipaglaban gamit ang kanilang mga armas. So dito sa kuwebang ito, dito sila nagtago at nagdasal ang mga Katipunero sa paniniwalang mabibigyan sila ng lakas na kagaya ng kay Bernardo Carpio. Next is Teodoro Patino. So, siya ang Isa pa dito ang ginawang pagtatraidor ni Teodoro Patino, na ang ugat sa hindi pagkakaintindihan sa mga miyembro ng kilusan. Sa balintawak, sa kabilang pagkakahuli sa karamihan sa kanilang miyembro ay nagdesisyon pa rin sila na ituloy ang revolusyon at dito na nangyari ang tanyag na isigaw ng Pugad Lawin. So, Magdalaw versus Magdiwang. Bilang napagtagumpayan sa revolusyon, hindi naiiwasang magkaroon ng hindi pagkakaintindihan, lalo na sa kapangyarihan, sa katipunan. Ang pagkakaroon ng dalawang panig sa loob ng kilusan ay nagresulta sa labanan sa kapangyarihan ng pamumuno. Para masolusyonan ang laban sa dalawang panig na ito, dinaan nila ito sa pamamagitan ng pagpupulong na kilala sa kasaysayan bilang Tejeros Convention. Sa nangyaring pagpupulong na ito bilang mga taong lalamang sa tagumpay sa revolusyon at antas ng pinag-aralan ng ibabaw ang panig ng Magdalo kung kaya't nagkaroon ng reformasyon sa pamumuno. Subalit sa tingin ng kasalukuyang Supremo Andres Bonifacio, ang nangyaring halalan ay tila nag-iisang pang-iinsulto sa kanya. So bakit ba? Kung kaya't sa kanyang kapangyarihan ay ipinawalang bisa niya yung nangyaring eleksyon. Dahil sa nangyaring ito, mas lumalim ang lamat sa ugnayan ni Bonifacio at ni Aguinaldo. Chapter 12, The Second Cup. American warship Maine was mysteriously exploded, resulting for the United States to declare war against Spanish. Within a month, the American-Spanish War had erupted, and 6 days after its declaration, the Spanish fleet destroyed in the lead of Commodore George Dewey. The Americans made fools out of Filipinos by entering the sea just a Philippine independence is within reach. We have four major forces on the historical stage. So first is the Spanish colonialism. Was avoiding its possible defeat with conciliatory move. American imperialism was waiting for its enough time to have a strong military forces in the area before moving on its true plan. Next is the Filipino Lestrados. Supposed goal was for independence, but long before they began to fight the Americans, they were already considering the possibility of accepting a protectorate or even annexation, just as they had been disposed to accept the continuation of Spanish rule after the Pact of Biak na Bato. Last is the Filipino masses were in state of ignorance regarding American imperialism, since their supposed recognized leaders, the Ilustrados, were naive, opportunist, and self-serving. So after many military war against Spain and different provinces in the country, the Spaniards eventually controlled only a few isolated outposts in the country. Chapter 13, Collaboration and Resistance. This chapter focuses on collaboration of prominent or in position Filipinos and Spanish descent to the Americans. So this is a time where the Filipinos are newly freed by the Spanish ruling in the Americans try to invade the country. The resistance occurs as Filipinos try to fight with the new invader that leads them to tortures. The collaboration of the Ilustrados provided the American with a ready justification for their colonization of the Philippines. So the Ilustrados was the European educated middle-class Filipinos. So they collaborated to the American against to the Spaniards. Chapter 14, Collaboration and Resistance to the New Katipunan. In 1901 and 1902, many resistance groups began to organize under different leaders. One notable person was General Luciano San Miguel, who survived the Sugbu attack by the Spanish forces. With this, he managed to rouse the wrongs from General MacArthur. San Miguel went to Rizal province in January 1903, offer of amnesty by agreeing to surrender, the cordon tactic of constabulary. He went to Rizal province in his reason of establishing a new version of a Katipunan. First is the mass support, the skirmishes and battle ambushes and raids of resistant fighters. Support to disturb the American accusation. Material extent come from what one might deem as a hostile resources. Amigo Act. The Amigo Axe is the cordon tactic field encountered by blending with populations to move easily, and guerrillas continues to mobilize their movements. So, American labeled this act as Amigo Act for having the disciplined movement in hostile population. The Tagalog Republic. Filipino Republic is a newly established organization referred as a Tagalog Republic. So, Macario Sakay as its leader and under his command is Julian Montalan. Sakay arrived out of his men and challenged Americans for the independence of the country. This is the sanctuary and supplies. The mass support extended to the forces of Sakay, Montalan, Felizardo, and their lieutenants. Yes, because local governors refused to give information regarding the guerrillas as well as using the taxation from merchants, former slavers with 10% of their income for their fundings, and muchacho boys were the servant of American, using them as a spies and gathering supplies from the American themselves. These are Chapter 15, New Outposts and Preserve, Rationalizations of Expansionism. Various arguments are made for expansionism. Some called it manifested destiny, while others, influenced by social Darwinism, regarded it as an unavoidable result for racial inequality. Economic roots. It was a North victory that eventually permitted as full operation of capitalism, forces to restrained by the elements of the South's economy. As a result, the United States experience was industrial development, and rise in the output of produced items result in the formation of new markets. The Philippine role. At this time, America is figuring out how to receive her fair share. Being a latecomer, Philippines was an answer to its rationale for being able to infiltrate China economically and evangelistically. People believed that American sovereignty would be good to their economic interests, with the specific interest of American business, the Sugar Trust. The new Dingley tariff gave a boost to beat sugar growers and local refiners, threatening the Sugar Trust existence. The real debate. Reliance that Aguinaldo appears to have the Democrats unjustified. During the early years of occupation, political and administrative practices aimed to quell public opposition to colonialism. The anti-imperialism or annexation opponents. This group is opposed to outright territory conquest. The anti-imperialism that resisted Philippine colonization is not the same as the anti-imperialism that drives national liberation movements in many underdeveloped countries today. In search of patron. Because they were aware of American interest, the Filipino Estados were keen to acquire a foreign sponsor to bankroll the revolution against Americans in as early as 1897. Chapter 16, Colonial Society and Politics. Economic exploitation of the colony could be efficiently carried out under condition of peaceful acceptance of colonial rule, subduing the spirit and seducing the mind of Filipinos. Pacific through education, principal agent of Americanization, public school system, adoption of English as medium of instruction, so by teaching Filipinos the English language and inculcating in them an appropriation. Pensionado system, instituted 1903, a scholarship program for Filipinos to attend school abroad, one of the ways by which Americans attracted the Filipino elite to their side. Quezon's View. The McClintock draft is worrying, examining as reflection of Quezon's views, is provided for an almost completely autonomous government and called for a census to be taken in 1915 and one every 10 years. Reconciliation. The reconciliation between Osmeña and Quezon had another motivation besides the desire to resolve the leadership question in the legislature. Patronage. The important aspect of this combination, to which you have give the gentle name of cooperation because of the benefits that the system gives you, is not then other than the patronage. Ominous prediction. Rector likewise assailed the colonial powers' techniques of satisfying ambition Filipino leaders with high official title while retaining the real power for itself, and accurately predicted the kind of independence the Filipino would have. A colonial document. The Constitution itself had to be approved by the American president even before that could be submitted to the Filipino people. Transition to neo-colonialism. The colony was ito transition to becoming the new colony. American colonial powers has successfully trained Filipino politicians to become to the colonialist spokesman. Private manifest. Second most important leader of the Filipinos working to postpone independence indefinitely at a time he himself acknowledged that he was more than ever his countrymen's desire. Chapter 17, Turbulent Decades. During the process of integration of the Filipinos elite into the colonial apparatus, while prominent leaders of the revolution were finding accommodation within the political structure through appointment or election to public office, and throughout the period when a new crop of American educated leaders learned to use the independence campaign as a means to enhance their personal power and positions, the masses persisted in their allegiance to the goal of national independence. The grievances, the testimonies of those arrested revealed that abuses committed by Tayug officials, especially the town president, the treasurer, and the justice of the peace, and by some constabulary soldiers had led to the peasants to seek by overthrow the municipal government by force. The colorums was also declared that they fought the constabulary in order to secure the independence of the country. New slogan: in the newspaper, muling pagsiyang Loki Santos advocate the setting up of a common organization of workers and peasants to protest abuses of landlords in the capitals. Peasants Unionization. The Union ng Magsasaka was formed in Bulacan in 1917 to fight the evils of tenancy and usury. Unions and Politics. Also in 1919, the Legionaries del Trabajo was formally organized of the strike against the Manila Electric Company. So, Crisanto Evangelista, one of its organizers. On the eve war, of another front, however, left groups joined other organizations in the anti-fascist fight. They helped organize the Hitler conferences with student leaders and civic workers in Manila. Chapter 18, A Usable Past. The past as a historical reality must be viewed as an integral part of the process of unfolding total reality. The present must be perceived as a part of the process constituted by a real historical past dissolving into a real historical future. Only when the present is seen as a continuation of historical process, as part of history in flux, can the future be consciousless shaped. The past should not be the object of more contemplation if the present is to be meaningfully. For if the past were viewed as frozen reality, it would either dominate and immobilize the present or be discarded as irrelevant to today's concerns. Inputs of experience. The participation of people in the various uprising inevitable endowed them with the beginnings of political awareness. They saw what concerted effort meant. They were able to experience the sensation of collective and therefore intensified hatred against their oppressors. Unity and division. The tradition of struggle against a common enemy was a principal factor in forging a consciousness of nationality.
Let us examine who was the author, what was his name, personality, character, positions, and qualification as a reporter of this document. So, 102 years ago nung isilang si Renato Constantino sa lungsod ng Maynila. He was born on March 10, 1990. Filipino historian, academic, educator who taught Filipinos to evaluate, correct, and learn from our colonial history. Sinulat niya ang aklat na The Philippines, A Past Revisited na nagbigay ng bagong alab sa mga makapilipinong pananaw sa kasaysayan. Itinuro sa kanya ng abogado niyang ama kung paano maging kritikal sa mga politiko. Si Renato Constantino ay produkto ng mga pampublikong paaralan na naging mahusay sa panunulumpati at pakikipagdebate. Constantino attended the University of the Philippines where he became the youngest editor of the university students' publications, the Philippine Colegian. Gaya nga ng sinasabi, naging isa sa pinakabatang editor ng The Philippine Colegian sa pahayagan ng Universidad ng Pilipinas. Dahil sa kanyang kritikal na editorial ukol sa Pangulong Manuel Quezon, si Quezon mismo ang tumungo sa UP upang ipaliwanag ang kanyang panig. Lumaban si Renato Constantino sa Bataan noong panahon ng digmaan at naging bahagi ng intelligence laban sa mga Hapones. 2 beses muntik mahuli, ngunit nakakatakas at nakakalusot palagi. Napangasawa naman ni Renato noong 1943 ang isang matalino na literature major ng UP na si Leticia Rojas na pamangkin ni Pangulong Manuel Rojas. Matapos ang digmaan, naging isang diplomat, sumama sa The Philippine Mission United Nations mula 1946 hanggang 1949 bilang Executive Secretary at nahirang na Counselor ng Department of Foreign Affairs mula 1949 hanggang 1951. Ngunit dahil sa kanyang malayang pagpapahayag ng mga kritisismo sa pamahalaan, siya ay tinanggal sa serbisyo. Nagtungo siya sa maraming pamantasan sa bansa at sa maraming lungsod sa ibang bansa at sumulat sa maraming pahayagan sa loob ng 5 dekada. Ngunit ang kanyang pinakamalaking ambag ay ang makatao at nasyonalistang pananaw sa kanyang aklat na The Philippines, A Past Revisited. His writing from pamphlets, columns, and books are concentrated in influencing generations of young Filipinos, kaya't hindi humigit sa 80 pamphlets na ang kanyang nalikha. At ngayon, siya ay kinikilala bilang most influential Filipino writer in the 20th century at nakapasama sa The Wall of Remembrance at the Philippines Bantayog ng mga bayani or sa libingan ng mga bayani. How was he interested in the event related? So the Philippines, A Past Revisited was published with the help of his wife, Leticia R. Constantino in 1975. He was related in the event because he was attempting at broadening and enlarging the understanding of the Filipino in the Philippine historiography. It critically examines an eye-opener and honest piece of literature. Next is, how was he situated for observation of the facts? The analysis pointed out by Constantino are mostly, if not all, liberating and informative to a fault. It is not direct, as there are some parts that I may have found one-dimensional for reasons. Nevertheless, it has a dramatic flair of resounding to its audience, rage, and betrayal while scanning through its chapters. Unfortunately, here is where Constantino's effort fails. As his framework of analysis, he has chosen a rigid Marxist historical theory as he explained his positions in the opening. His determinist historical theory will not allow. It is ironic that in Constantino's effort to look at Philippine historiography through Filipino eyes, he adopts for himself a framework borrowed from a Western, non-Filipino traditions, no less than the simplistic view of the clerical historians of the 17th and 18th centuries. The Marxist version too fails to give their due value of all the multiple factors which have contributed to the development of the Filipino people. Next question is, how soon after the events was document written? So the document was written and published in 1975 after how many years of being colonized by Spanish the Second War. For on purpose, the document was able to achieve its goal, and it is to let Filipino understand history and reflects our understanding of our identity. If we are unfamiliar with our history, do we even have the right to call ourselves Filipinos? Our misconceptions, biases, distort the truth behind our records. If not corrected, it will all be passed down to the next generations. Next question. How was the document written? From memory, after consultation with others, after checking the facts, or by combining earlier trial drafts? So the document was written by merely a combination of earlier trial drafts. The Past Revisited, Constantino wrote that history is a merely relied on Marxist historical theory. The book contains a detailed and concrete long summary of the clarification on the historical misconceptions of prior historians toward the country's past, including the colonial, education, and religious. And last question is, how is the document relate to other documents? Is it original source? The answer is, it is not an original source. He just simply re-examined the past using past historical records. He borrowed the Marxist historical theory. This document can be related to Antonio Pigafetta's journal, which is the first voyage around the world. In Jonato's book, he represents the life of a Filipino based on what he read, while the journal of Antonio Pigafetta, which is the primary source, give a full, detailed base on his experiences during voyage. In conclusion, Renato Constantino's critical review and reassessment of the Philippine history through his book, his purpose of broadening in the young generation's knowledge through revisiting the historical past was achieved.
Number 1. Who was the author? Eyewitness or second-hand account? The author of the book, A Past Revisited, is Renato Constantino, and he is not an eyewitness but only a second-hand. Number 2. Why was it written? His book is entitled The Philippines, The Past Revisited. He wrote this book with the help of his family to show the reason why the Philippines is like this today. This book is about what happened from the conquest of our Spaniards until World War II. Number 3. Is the connection between him, her, and the document a natural and plausible one? The document is not a convincing and plausible one because he does not present any basis, especially the very important primary sources. Nothing. He simply said that the original Filipinos were the Insulares. He simply said that the original Filipinos were the Insulares. What Constantine did was a big mistake in the principles of historical research and writing because it is a law in historiography that if a historian has something to say or write, he must have a credible basis such as a primary sources as proof of what he is going to say or write. Number 4. Could she have been in the place indicated the time indicated? He was out of place and at that time. As said earlier, he wrote this book to show the reasons why the Philippines is like this today. Let's say he only recounted the events when the Spanish occupied us by just sharing what he knew that came from the book he read. Was the information given in the document original with him, her, or did he copy it from someone else? The information contained in the book was not original to him, but he simply copied it for the others. As mentioned earlier, he simply wrote that book based on a book he read in which no information actually came from him. Are the statements made in the documents consistent with known level of intelligence, education, experience, and individual temperament of the purported writer? The information or statement contained in the document is in accordance with the known level of intelligence, education, experience, and individual character of the presumed writer. In the field of intelligence and education, we cannot deny that many people make books like this one based on the books they have read. It also went through a long process to record the details in this book. But this book But in this book, there is information that is said to be unreliable because there is no basis for what is true. When it comes to the said real experiences and behavior, it is based on real events in the life of the eyewitness and the habits he had in how he used them at that time.
Mention at least one of the memorable aspect of the book so that the class will remember something distinctive about your book. I think one of the memorable aspect of this book is how it examines the specific information of colonizers, manipulation, struggles, and oppression po of the Filipino people back then. Because its clarity and directness allow readers like us to grasp our views in a concise and understandable manner that allows everyone to examine past historical teachings that can be a key in searching for true independence.